Well, good evening, all you teachers out there watching, those sitting here in the audience. We're back at it again after a 2-week break with Life Action. I'm going to step over here and just shut the doors, but keep talking. So here we are in Nehemiah chapter 8. It's our second of 3 weeks in the book of Nehemiah. And next week we're actually just going to be jumping one chapter over into Nehemiah 9, but there's quite a bit of material from Nehemiah that we could bring into these lessons and help us better explain what's going on in the second piece. I won't say half. It's, not quite as robust as, or a little bit more robust, I should say, than Ezra is. But nonetheless, the second piece to this joint work of Ezra and Nehemiah, because these two books collectively have nothing that is shared with the people from a prophet that is categorized as the words the Lord has said in the phrase of, "Thus saith the Lord." There's no direct communication going on to the people from the Lord. But of course, it's a very important placeholder that gives us an understanding of how things are changing from the exilic period into now the beginning stages of the post-exilic period. And again, the way I'm sharing this information with you is trying to somewhat capture an understanding of how the theology of the pre-exilic period, as goes the Messiah, the reassertion of the kingdom period, and God's plan for His people that was forecasted by those pre-exilic prophets, Isaiah and the guys going through the beginning stages of the exile, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and that message thrust upon this community of exiles coming out of captivity. But as they see everything that's happening around them, and prophecy being fulfilled, but not exactly the way they thought it would. And of course, we've got about another 400 years of time to go before Jesus arrives on the stage. How does this inform the theology of what we're seeing in the New Testament with respect to statements being made in the crowds communicating back and forth, seeing the things that Jesus is doing, hear the things He's saying, and reckoning amongst themselves, is He the Messiah? He has to be the Messiah. No, this guy can't be the Messiah, right? So some of that is going to come from places like this. All right, so we're exclusively in Ezra chapter 8. The CSB has a weird chapter break right here. The beginning of this sentence, for some reason, is the first half of the last verse of chapter 7, but I'm just going to move on with the beginning of chapter 8. But to try to arrange this in such a way that we've kind of got a loose chronology in play, remember, we have good textual clues as to the time frame in which Ezra and Nehemiah are ministering in. Ezra comes around the seventh year of a king that goes by the name, or is assigned the name, Artaxerxes, and Nehemiah roughly 13 years later. So there's a considerable time gap between them. So now that Nehemiah is on the scene and Ezra is still there, we are at the latter half of this ministry with respect to Nehemiah's involvement, and the wall has been built, just not yet dedicated. So all the people are gathered together in the square in front of the water gate, and they ask Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had given Israel. So for you teachers, I would call your attention back to Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7 introduces Ezra as a character into our story, as goes the mandate that he is being given by the king, and the reason why he is not only leading this group of exiles in a new Exodus journey back to the land, but also with the task that he is given. He is given a massive amount of wealth to go back and beautify the temple, because the temple's already been built. The temple is finished in the 6th year of Darius, and I particularly advocate what's often known as the short chronology and trying to reckon the books of Ezra and Nehemiah together. A lot of popular commentaries and scholarly opinion as a consensus seems to represent the idea that there's a 60-year gap between the events of Ezra and Nehemiah, but there are several textual clues that really seem to shorten this down, and some scholarly hint to the idea that maybe Ezra is actually in Jerusalem in the 7th year of Darius, which would mean that the person that goes by the name Artaxerxes in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is really not Artaxerxes the First, it's Darius. We don't have time to go through that. If you want to know more about that, I would encourage you to go back and listen to the lesson that I taught online last week. There's about a good hour breakdown of all that information. But nonetheless, when we get to Ezra chapter 7, if Ezra is coming in the time of Darius the First, this is very quickly after the temple is finished, not 60 years later. Instead, it's right after the temple is finished, and his job is to not only adorn the temple with more gold and silver, but also to teach the people the words of the law of Moses. And it's important for us as teachers to make sure we're paying good attention to the lists of names that are given to us in the joint works of Ezra and Nehemiah. Sure, there's lots of names being thrown out, but when you get to Ezra chapter 7, and certainly Nehemiah chapters 10 and 12, those names of the priestly families, the heads of those priestly families are important. And what we'll see is that Ezra is a direct descendant of Aaron. And he is a member of not only a priestly household, but potentially a contender if the lot were to fall on him in just the right way. And he would be eligible to serve in the position of high priest. But he's not. Having said that, his task is to come back and teach the people the law of Moses so that they will satisfactorily live up to their contractual end of the covenant their ancestors made with the Lord at Sinai. So, verse 2, on the first day of the 7th month. Now, teachers, this is going to require some digging on our part, because when we have time synchronizations like this, sometimes they're not important. But most of the time, more often than not, they are important. So there's quite a bit of significance to this moniker here of the 7th month. And we can go to several places in the Old Testament. The first that we would look at is Leviticus chapter 23. In Leviticus 23, we have a laydown of what could be called the high holy days, the days in which all of Israel's men from all of her tribes are supposed to come and present themselves before the Lord at the place where he will cause his name to dwell, from the words that Moses gives. And he will lay down more information about what is to be offered on these particular high holy days in places like Numbers 23 and some places in Deuteronomy like Deuteronomy 26 and whatnot. Now, with respect to the 7th month and most of the offerings or high holy days, these festive occasions, not much information is given in Deuteronomy that's of additional help, but Numbers is a good companion. So Numbers 23 and Leviticus 23. I believe it's Numbers 23. It's either 23 or 33. I'm sorry, I don't have my outline in front of me. But anyway, one of those two chapters. If that still doesn't do it for you, you could simply use your electronic Bible app, type in the search line 7th, and it'll pull up all the instances that's used in the book of Numbers, and you should see it in one of those two chapters. But the drill down is the understanding of, in Leviticus, the day and the significance behind the celebration. In Numbers, there's a lot more embellishment as to what exactly is to be offered prescriptively, because in the books of Exodus and Leviticus, we understand they're going to start offering up a lamb in the morning and the evening for a burnt offering. And then, while that becomes the basal level unit for the sacrifice, because it occurs every single day, Moses is going to build on that in other places through Torah that he starts talking about what things are to be offered. So by the time we get to Numbers and we talk about these high holy days, they've already been mentioned in Leviticus, but only the specific offering, as goes, case in point, the Day of Atonement. It's actually in Leviticus 23 that we get the first mention of the Day of Atonement, which actually happens also in the 7th month. It's important for us to know as teachers that the 7th month in the religious calendar year for Israel is the most busy of all the months. Microphone falling off. Put this back on there real quick. It's the busiest of all the months because it has the most liturgical days or high holy festive days beginning on the 1st of the month, and then of course the 16th in the month, and then toward the end of the month as well. We'll touch on the 16th, go back to the first here in just a second. But the Day of Atonement. In Leviticus 23, we're told the exact offerings that the high priest are to give first for himself, then for the nation of Israel. But in Numbers 23, when we pair those chapters together, we understand there is a lot more going on than just those particular offerings of first a bull for himself, and then the 2 goats for the nation of Israel on the Day of Atonement. There are many other offerings of different kinds, of fellowship offerings and burnt offerings and so forth. And so when we put these chapters together, what we come to the understanding of is that the first day of the 7th month is the day of the Feast of Trumpets. Now with that, there's supposed to be a blasting of the ram's horn all throughout the land. And while this happens every year, it gains the most significance in the 50th year. Can anybody think why that is? When you think about the cyclical pattern of what happens in Israelite life, year in and year out, every 50 years, we have a special event that lasts the entire year. Anybody have an idea what the name of that year is? Right, the year of Jubilee. So it comes after a series of 7 sevens, or 7 sabbatical years. And on the sabbatical year, there's not supposed to be any planting and whatnot. There's supposed to be a temporary remittance of debts. But in the 50th year, this thing explodes. It's another year of no working, as goes planting and harvesting. It's everybody eating off the land as if, this place is an Eden, and everybody gets a chance to just go and enjoy what grows naturally and trust that God is going to provide for both man and beast. But then, of course, the announcement is that everybody will go back to their homes, as goes wherever you came from. If you're from the tribe of Dan, but for some reason you had to sell yourself into slavery to pay off your debts, your master has to let you go. You go back to your home, you get your land back, your house back. All of your debts are forgiven according to the law of Moses. In other places, whenever a slave is let go, they have to be let go with part of the earnings or possessions of his master. You don't just simply turn a slave out with empty pockets. You have to give them from your stores, as goes food. You have to give them clothes and money. It's like the year of Jubilee is a total reset point for the entire nation. Now you're like, well, that's great. What does this have to do with Nehemiah? Nothing. There's nothing about the year of Jubilee mentioned here. But all of that stuff is baked into the cake, such that when a Jewish reader of Scripture comes across this phrase, the 7th month, these are the things that's reverberating in the back of their minds. The understanding of the significance of what happens in the 7th month every year, and of course it all builds to the crescendo of that 50th year. But you have to think about it in the significance of what's going on right now. What's happening right now? The circumstance is the release from captivity, the going back to the land, and the end of exile. And the year of Jubilee in the Scriptures takes on that theme. You think about Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, He has anointed me to preach. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus standing in the synagogue in his hometown and telling them all as he reads from that part of Isaiah, today this Scripture has been fulfilled. And what he's talking about is he is announcing not only his place as Messiah, but as the Spirit bringer, but he is also announcing the fact that captivity is over with. Captivity not just from Rome, but captivity from sin, all those things. The end of the real captivity that's been going on even after they leave Persia and go back to their homeland. So the first day of the 7th month, it's hugely significant that on the day of the Feast of Trumpets, when they're blowing these ram's horns, and even though it's not saying that's going on in Nehemiah, we would have every right to assume this is probably the first time in Israel's history since the days of Joshua that they have been this stringent and ardently observant of the law of Moses throughout the land, with everybody having or striving to gain a unified mind, a unified heart, and everybody being on the right pace for a change. And so if that's the case, if they're being very careful to observe everything, and they're meticulously reading through the law, and Ezra being an expert per Ezra chapter 7 and the description of who he is and what he knows and the intent of him coming back and educating these people, by the time of Nehemiah 8, Ezra has already been with them for at least 13 years. If he's been with them for at least 13 years and he has been teaching them, then at this point it's no surprise what they're supposed to do at the beginning of the 7th month. They know to be blowing the horns, and it's a festive day of celebration. So for them to be back in their land after captivity is over with, anticipating the arrival of Messiah, the Messianic age, for them to be reading from the law of Moses is particularly significant because it's the announcement of sorts in a symbolic way of the end of exile and the beginning of a new period, a new chapter for them, as now more and more exiles are pouring into the city, and they finally have the wall built, and Jerusalem, in a sense, has become the city that it was before the exile began. All the vestiges of what happened when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed their city are being washed away. They finally rebuilt the temple. Now the walls are complete, and the last task is to finally get people living in the houses so it can be a bustling metropolitan area again. Anyway, continuing the verse 2. The priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly of men, and all who could listen with understanding. Now, we could go through the rest of this, but I'm not going to read verses 3 through 6. The big point I would have you take away from this is the particular characters that are helping Ezra. Notice their station. They're all Levites. Now, this is important because this is a task that was entrusted only to the family of Levi. So, teachers, I would call your attention back to Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 10. Now, this comes in the terrible moment of the tragedy of the death of Aaron's first two sons, Nadab and Abihu. When that happened, and Aaron is reeling, I mean, it's literally that raw and visceral for him that his sons are dead and their carcasses are still lying there on the ground. But then God, in some way, speaks directly to Aaron and tells him what his chief responsibility is, and that is to teach the people of Israel the difference between the clean and the unclean, between the holy and the profane or the common. So Aaron's job is not small by any means. Consider what just happened with respect to his two sons and the fact they violated sacred space by going into God's proximity unauthorized. And by virtue of that, God made an example out of them by letting his holiness break out in the form of fire and destroying them. So that is to stand as the abject lesson that's to be learned for everyone if you violate the holy or the holiness of God. There are prescriptive things that can be done depending on the level of violation. We go back to Leviticus chapter 5 and 6, and we come to the understanding that's the purpose of the guilt offering, is to make restitution if you violate the Lord's holy things. But if you take this to the level of what Nadab and Abihu did, you very well may find yourself dead. So part of Aaron's responsibility, the sacredness of this job, is to make sure that people understand what is required of them to be able to be accepted by the Lord. And Moses does not put all that information in one succinct small space in Torah. It's spread out all throughout Torah, right? So these people are going to have to take it upon themselves to teach the people. We don't really have many examples of that in the Old Testament, with the exception of one. 2 Chronicles, we have Jehoshaphat. He has taken it upon himself in his sincere devotion to bring Judah back in line with the legacy of David and cause them to leave and abandon the high places and worship the Lord God exclusively. He is the only king we have record of, even beyond David, who actually took it upon himself to bring the Levites together and told them, you're going to take a copy of the words of Moses and you're going to go town by town, village by village, door by door, and you are going to go in and sit down amongst the people and you will read the law and you will teach them what it means. So one can't help but think that Ezra in some way is taking a chapter out of Jehoshaphat's book and repeating the same experiment here and now. Instead of having to go to everybody's houses, though, he's got everybody together in one corporate setting because of the high festive day of the Feast of Trumpets. And he's going to read the law, and the Levites are going to stand amongst the people, translate what it means. Hopefully we as teachers understand at this point in the progression of the Old Testament narrative as goes linear history, that at this point, many people who have lived for decades or their whole lives in captivity in Babylon have picked up other languages other than Hebrew, and many of them perhaps were born in households that did not speak Hebrew any longer. And so because they do not know Hebrew, as Ezra and the Levites do, some translation is going to have to go on for them to understand these words. So then we go on to verse 7 and beyond, which just lays this out a little bit more for us, as goes the significance of the Levites teaching and interpreting for the people. Now, it would be interesting for us to know what portions of the law that Nehemiah or Ezra might have been reading from. It seems to be the choice favorite of scholars and commentators to always go right to the book of Deuteronomy. They do the same thing when it comes to 2 Kings and chapters 18 and beyond. When we start looking at the story of Josiah, that portion of the book of Moses that was read in his presence that caused him to have that emotional upheaval of, we are obviously violating God's sacred commands. And he stands up from his throne and rends his garb. Well, these people start crying, they start mourning, and probably because they're convicted over the things that they have done. And no better place than Deuteronomy do you find the words of Moses spelling it out in no uncertain terms what will happen if they are faithful to the covenant they made with God and all the blessings they would receive, or if they fail to be faithful. Moses in Deuteronomy, more than any of the 5 books of Torah outside Deuteronomy, continues to reiterate the fact that God will bring punishment, and it will be severe, and it will be awful. And these people have lived through that, and now they're coming to the end of it. But nonetheless, we can't press that too hard. We don't know exactly what portion of the book's being read from. But notice this. That should be the response of the people, that they should mourn and grieve over the sin of their ancestors, and their own for that matter. But notice the response of Ezra and the other Levites. They go to comfort them and to tell them, no, no, no. This is not a day of mourning. This is a day of joy, of gladness. And then they tell them to celebrate by not preparing food, because the day of the Festival of Trumpets is not to be a day of work. It's like a Sabbath. And it doesn't matter what day of the week it falls upon, it becomes a Sabbath. No work can be done, including the preparation of food. Food would have already needed to be prepared at this point, which means that you have something of a limitation on how much that you have for your own family. But now, as part of them being joyfully glad, they are told to not only go and eat, but to share food with people who did not prepare. Now, this is important, because as we read the larger context of Nehemiah, we go back to Nehemiah chapter 5, and one of the things that Nehemiah just got so angry over was the idea that these people, his own countrymen, were letting their brothers and sisters go destitute without food until they got to the breaking point in which they had to sell their own children just to buy grain to feed themselves with. And by virtue of that, Nehemiah acts almost in a volatilely violent way, and he castigates all of them for doing this. He's like, because these are the very things that caused our ancestors to go into captivity. The law of Moses clearly says we cannot do that. And so he tries to rectify those wrongs. But even though he's working to try to fix these issues, it does not mean that there are not people who are terribly destitute and poor within this Israelite community. But just like David, on the day when he is bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to install it in the tent that he's made for it, because it's God's throne and Jerusalem is the capital of the king, both the human king and the divine king. And on that day, David treats everyone as exactly the same. They're all equals, nobles to the poor. Everybody gets the same provisions of food. So in a sense, we kind of see a revival of that going on here. For the first time since the days of David, we have all or most of Israel gathered together in great joy at a procession going on here, though it's not the installation of the ark or anything like that. It's the reading of the law, which of course is contained in the ark. And then with that, everybody are dining together as equals around the table. Now, to round off this chapter, verses 13 through 18, we have kind of a repeat of a frame that we've already seen in the book of Ezra, but these are not going on concomitantly. In the early portions of Ezra, chapter 3, he talks about what happened when the initial wave of exiles come into the land, and they arrive at Jerusalem, and of course the city is still largely in ruins. They haven't even built the foundation of the temple yet, but they either make a new altar or repair the altar and start offering the morning and the evening burnt offerings. And then in the 7th month, which was actually the month they all show up in the 7th month and start offering these things, they arrive just in time for the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, or shelters, or booths, depending on what your translation may say. Now this is interesting. This is something that we should note as teachers that is not incidental. 3 chapters into the book of Ezra, we have this community of exiles celebrating the Feast of Shelters. And nearly 5 chapters before the end of Nehemiah, we have another community of exiles added to this one who are all celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. This collective joint work of Ezra and Nehemiah is almost bookended by the same feast. And do a search throughout the rest of the Old Testament. You do not find at any other moment a mention of the entire congregation of Israel celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles. So teachers, again, I would adjure you to go back to Leviticus 23, Numbers 23 or 33, whatever that chapter is, and also look up what the significance of these days are. I'll try to give you as best a synopsis as I can. But in the book of Numbers, when you look at the offerings that are given every single day, you have burnt offerings that are supposed to be offered up and whatnot as per the regular schedule. But when we start the celebration, it's a 7-day feast, we start by offering 14 bulls, then we go down to 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, then 7. And when you add up the amount of bulls that are offered every single day of the Feast of Tabernacles, what you ultimately wind up with is 70. Now, anytime that number 70 is used throughout the Old Testament, it is to signify the nations. It carries us right back to Genesis chapter 10 and the Table of Nations. The Table of Nations is given before the events of chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. And of course, we know what happened there, right? When God confounded the languages, and we have the carving out of different civilizations that will come from the remnants of what was the one race. And according to Jewish custom and tradition, that has been always the figure of 70. 70 nations were born the day the events of the Tower of Babel happened. So anytime we have this mechanism where we have the number 70 tied to offerings, votive gifts like this, is to signify the nation's involvement as a symbol, a symbolic gesture. So get this. Here we have the Feast of Tabernacles, which is supposed to signify what the Lord wanted them to remember. In Leviticus 23, we go to the end of the chapter, and God says, you will do this memorially year by year, so that your descendants will know that I, the Lord, brought your ancestors out of Egypt and caused them to dwell in booths or tabernacles in the wilderness. Now, here's the funny thing about that. When you go back and you actually read the Exodus story, when and at what point do you find the Israelites actually dwelling in booths? I think a thing that we normally do is we just kind of substitute out in our mind that what that is meant to signify is that when they make these booths or shelters for themselves, it's to kind of hearken back to the tents that these people dwelled in. And that could be the case, but it seems like many Jewish commentators don't really see that connection as being the significance behind that there. Because if that were the case, then why wouldn't the command be that instead of you going out and building a booth for yourself, that you just pitch a tent in your backyard? Would that not be more resembling or more accurately resembling the experience of their ancestors to actually dwell under cloth tents for a week, because that's what they did when they moved around in the wilderness? This is where, again, and I always try to push you to this when I can find places to do it, it's important for us to incorporate lexical work when we're studying for our lessons. The name or word that is translated booths or tabernacles for us comes from the Hebrew word Sukkot. It's actually called the Feast of Sukkot. Now, why is that important? Sukkot itself, in its most basic meaning across its noun and verb form, essentially means to cover. So in a way, when you build the booth and you build it the way it's prescribed for you to, with the branches of leafy, majestic trees, whether it's palm fronds or oaks or whatever, and then you fasten them together to become the canopy over your booth, it's providing you a covering from the heat of the sun. It's giving you shade. But now think about this. This was supposed to harken back to the days when they were wandering around in the wilderness. Now here you got a camp of people that is at least 600,000 men strong, plus all the women and children, so potentially numbering in the million or more at this point. How do you know where you're going? Well, you follow the person in front of you. But what about the person at the front of the procession? How do they know where they're going? Who is the one actually leading these people out in the wilderness, wherever it is that they travel? Who's the one that tells them this is where you need to stop and camp? And who's the one that signifies for them when it's time for them to break camp and move on? The angel of the Lord. And how is the angel of the Lord traveling with this group of people? In the form of a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. If you think about it, that pillar, cloud or fire, is a covering. In a sense, it's kind of like a sukkot to the people, is it not? They are walking with God and they are following God's glory cloud or presence wherever they go. So there is perhaps some symbolism that's meant to attach itself to the idea that when they are dwelling together in these booths, they're sleeping there, they are eating there, they're doing everything that is considered life in these booths for the 7 days that they have dedicated to this. It's to hearken back to the idea that their ancestors not simply dwelt in tents versus actual houses made of mud and brick and all that stuff that they have the pleasure of. It's that they got the chance to walk with God's glory cloud until He settled them in the land. And they also, in the land, get the experience of living amongst God's glory cloud. Now let's tie this into the nations, because the festival of the Feast of Booths is supposed to remember the nations. And as a placeholder, it gives the idea that one day the nations are going to come along. They're going to come alongside Israel and become part of her people and join in the celebration of God leading them out of darkness, leading them out of their captivity that started at Babel to join God's family, and all of them, Israel and the Gentile nations, dwelling together as one conglomerate body. And I would adjure you then to go and look at places like Isaiah chapter 2, especially Isaiah 4, the idea that Isaiah 2 shows that the nations and Israel will all be streaming up the cosmic mountain of God, Zion, to hear the word of the Lord. And in Isaiah 4, the idea that God Himself will become a canopy, a cloud, a sukkot, over top of the summit of this mountain where the nations are going to come and worship. And the reason why I draw attention to all of that is because it's fascinating that after we get out of this chapter in Nehemiah, from here to the rest of the book, we've got Nehemiah having to confront his countrymen yet again over violations of the law. But one thing that is held in common between Ezra 10, and Nehemiah 13 is this issue with their men marrying foreign wives. And then they try to go to the law and figure out, well, what are we to do about this? We're afraid this is going to cause a tainting of our people. And if that happens, we're going to fall into sin again, and God is going to send us off in exile again. And we don't want that. And it lends itself to the unfortunate circumstance of these Gentile wives being forced out of the community along with their children and basically left to fend for themselves. And it raises the interesting question, did this community of Israelites do the right thing? And how would we know? Because a prophet did not tell them to do this. God did not speak directly to anyone and tell them to do this. Now, I'm not trying to advocate one way or the other. It's just raising questions that hopefully you as teachers can help your students with in the weeks to come. So, any concluding thoughts or questions?